We've only done 2 screens together of our application, and that's all we're going to do together. Feel free to go on and keep playing. But you'll notice that the layers list has a lot of stuff on it already with only 2 screens. And it starts getting crazy. I mean, we've got a very simple interface here with very few elements, and our layers list is already kind of a mess. If you were to hand this off to another person the way it is, they might not be able to figure out exactly what you did or why you did what you did. So let's take a look at some of the ways that we can get more organized before it gets absolutely out of control. There are a few tips that I have for you that are going to help you deal with a disorganized document, and there are a few tips I have for you that are going to help you go from disorganized to organized. So let's talk about just navigating around when we have a chaotic document. Let's say I have a layer selected, and in this case I click, and it turns out it's a group. Some of these shortcuts we've already talked about, but I just want to reinforce some of them. If you hold the Command key when you click on a group, it drills down into the group. And even if you have a bunch of layers in that group, you'll be able to grab the individual layers instead of grabbing the group. Now, that has to do with whether or not this group is a regular group or if it's a click-through group. So let's reinforce that for a moment. This is a regular group. I've grouped these elements together, and they behave like one object. That's what happens when you group things. Let's highlight, I'm going to click and drag up here to highlight this control bar that we have at the top with just these elements in the blue bar. And I'm going to hit Command-G to group those together. Now, what just happened is it created a group. It titled it group. If you have a couple of elements that you're grouping together, it'll automatically name the group based on the objects that you've grouped together. But since we had, it looks like 4 or more elements grouped together, it's not going to name the group automatically. So I'm going to click again on the group. I'm going to double click, and that way it becomes editable. And the shortcut for that is Command-R. So if you ever have a group selected on the canvas and you don't want to go and click on it on the layers list, you can just press Command-R, and that's the shortcut to be able to rename that layer. So I'm going to type in control bar. I'm just going to name this control bar, and I'll hit return. And when I do that, this now behaves like one object. If I click away and click back on it, all these elements are sort of glued together. So again, I can hold the Command key if I'd like to click inside of that group instead of clicking on the group itself. Or I can choose over here on the inspector, click through when selecting. Now what that does is it allows me to create groups to stay organized on the layers list, but it doesn't stop me from clicking right inside. When I interact with my canvas, it's as if there's no group. It's not acting like they're grouped together, but if I look over here on my layers list, they are grouped together, and it helps me keep things very organized. So let's organize a few more things. I'm going to go to this whole middle section here, and I'm going to hit Command-G to group them together, and I'm going to name this artwork. I'll name it artwork area because we have a few things in there that are not artwork. And then down here, I'm going to highlight my whole control panel or navigation panel, call it what you will. I'm going to hit Command-G to group those together, and I'm going to name that, hit Command-R here, I'm going to name that controls. I should probably rename control bar. Let's call that menu bar instead. Perfect. So now I've got these groups, and each time I've hit Command-G, it's created a group where everything is glued together. So I've got to go back to artwork area, and I have to check the click through when selecting option. I have to go back to controls and check click through when selecting. And now they are going to behave like they're not groups when I'm clicking on things on the canvas, but they're going to behave like groups when I go to look at my layers list. So you can use groups just to stay organized on your layers list. That's the moral of that story, is you can just use them to stay organized. You don't have to use them to glue things together. I like to call that grouping for sanity instead of grouping for functionality. Now, the other reason to use groups, which we're going to talk about next, is when exporting assets. Sometimes you have multiple objects that are going to come together as one asset for the developers, and you can use groups for that reason as well. The next trick I have when navigating around a messy document, you may want to get something out of the way for a moment. You may have something selected, and it's in your way of something else. And the keyboard shortcut that I want to run by you for hiding something is Shift-Command-H. When you hit Shift-Command-H, it's the same as clicking the little eyeball on the layers list, but you don't have to go and look for that little eyeball. So it's a nice, handy little shortcut, Shift-Command-H. The other shortcut that comes in handy is Shift-Command-L, to lock a layer, because lock isn't quite so accessible. It's easy to unlock something from the layers list because you can just click on the lock that appears once the layer has been locked. But if the layer hasn't been locked, there isn't a lock icon on the layers list. So there's not a quick, easy way to do that aside from going to Arrange and choosing lock or unlock. And with that, you can also add a button to the toolbar, but Shift-Command-L is a whole heck of a lot faster. And when a layer is locked, you can click and drag over it, and you won't accidentally move it. You can lock a whole group, so it really comes in handy. If you lock something that's inside of another group, you can't tell by looking at the layers list. You can see that I locked this group, but it's inside another group. So I've got to go in there, and I've got to find it, and then once I find it, I can unlock it. So that can be a little confusing if you guys are locking groups inside of groups or objects inside of groups. And you can have a group inside a group inside a group, so you can really make things confusing for yourself. So just be careful to not put things in a place that does not make sense to you. It's all about what makes sense to you. If it makes sense to you, then it's totally fine, unless you're working with other people and collaborating on the same document, in which case you should probably consider them as well. But those are the shortcuts for locking and hiding: Shift-Command-H and Shift-Command-L respectively. Now the last thing I want to show you, which is a huge deal for Photoshop users. Photoshop users are usually not too excited that when you select a layer, if it's near something else or if it's on top of something else, and you go to move it and you miss, then you accidentally select something else and move the wrong thing. And when things are overlapping or underlapping, that can be extremely frustrating, because in Photoshop, when you have a layer selected, you get your move tool, and no matter where you go with the move tool, it's going to stay on the layer that was originally selected. It's not just going to switch layers on you unless you have that feature enabled. So the default behavior of Sketch is the opposite. If you click on the wrong thing, you are going to select and move the wrong thing. So the solution is very nice, very elegant, very simple. If you hold Option and Command at the same time when you have an object selected, you can click and drag from anywhere on the screen, and you will be able to move the selected object. You don't have to worry about reselecting it. You don't have to worry about clicking on the wrong thing. I find myself holding Option and Command almost every time I select something and I try to move it, especially when I have a lot of layers in a document. Otherwise, inevitably, I'm going to click and move the wrong thing. It's just inevitable when you have a lot of stuff on your canvas. So select an object, hold Option and Command, and then drag from anywhere on the screen, and you can move that object. When I learned that, oh boy, but that's like a game changer. That's an absolute game changer. It was for me. So hopefully you guys are stoked about that tip. All right, that does it for these pro tips for staying organized and managing the chaos. So now let's take a look at how we break our app apart into assets and get those assets out of Sketch so we can get them over to the developers, and also how we can show the art director or the developers or whoever else is involved what our comps look like so that they can see how it's supposed to come back together and just see what our app is supposed to look like.